All right, guys, welcome back to episode 2 of redoing the Hanchard Special Roadster behind me. As you can see in the open, we got the body lifted off. So just to recap last episode, we brought the car in, got it up in the air, took the cage out, started tearing stuff down to get to a clean slate. So now with the body off, I can kind of see what's underneath. There's a lot of extra brackets and stuff where the car had been modified over the years, and a little bit of corrosion and some stuff that I want to replace. So this brings up a really interesting area for guys restoring vintage race cars and some with a little bit of history. It would be much easier for me to just take the front cross member out, take the parts off, and then just use new tubing. It would be just a couple straight sections of 2x3 or 2x4 and making a kick up in the back to recreate this chassis. But when you do that, especially if you're dealing with like vintage Indy cars and other historic race cars that you need to keep kind of together and keep the documentation of the car, if you were to replace the frame completely, you would be devaluing that car because this is the original frame. So yes, I could just cut the cross member out, make a new frame, and that would be much faster and easier. But at what point am I restoring the car or just completely rebuilding the car? So with that said, I think I'm just going to clean all the brackets off, weld up any old holes, and just kind of correct a few things to help with the updating process. That way it keeps the original frame that was built for this car. So it sounds a little counterintuitive, but I'm willing to invest the extra time to do that just to keep the original frame that Shug built with the car. That way for me and any future buyers that want the history of the car, it is the original frame built for this race car. So I'm going to kind of pan over the frame a little bit, show you some of the stuff that I'm going to replace just either from corrosion or it's a no longer used bracket or tab, or just some stuff I want to clean up with updating into new parts. So I'll show you guys that stuff, and then I'll get to cutting off all the old brackets and tabs to get us down to a nice clean starting point. So here's the frame. It's a little crusty, but it was also raced on the salt for a long time, and it's been sitting around for a little over a decade. So I'm going to take the pedal assembly off because I'm going to switch to an automatic transmission, and then we are also going to use a swinging pedal so we can eliminate that and the bracketry that goes with it. And I'm also going to just cut off all of the roll cage mounting plates, because with building a new roll cage, those might move a little bit, so it'll be easier just to cut that off and start fresh. And then this center section here, it's a little crusty. With that, I feel comfortable just cutting it out and replacing it because I'm not replacing the whole frame. And just little stuff like that. There's a couple of little brackets like there that I'm not sure what it holds. So we'll just take that off, clean everything up, and kind of rebuild. So that's kind of what I'm going to do. So I think I'm about ready to get started with cutting off all the old stuff back to a clean slate, and we can build from there. All right, so I spent a little bit of time and got most everything cut off of the frame. I left the steering box mount and our wishbone mounts and stuff for now, just till I get the replacements made for those. That way, I'm not just taking the front end off and it hanging there loose for however long it takes me to get those mounts made. So I'll just leave those on for now, and I'll get everything else ready. Like I said, everything's just kind of rough cut off. There's still some welds and some sharp edges. So next up, I'm gonna get the grinder with a flap wheel on it. I'm going to dress all that stuff down, get everything smoothed out, cleaned up, and ready to start fresh. But I'm going to wrap it up for today. Got some stuff to do out of the shop later this afternoon. So like I said, I'm going to call it a day today, but I'll be back tomorrow and we will continue with cleaning up the frame. So make sure to stay tuned as things progress on that. All right, so I went back around and I ground down all the welds and what little bit of material from the brackets or tabs was still up, just to get everything down kind of clean, where I've cut off so far. And while I was doing that, I kind of noticed that there's a lot of scaly areas from rust and some paint easily flaking off. And I think at this point, instead of dealing with that, trying to clean it up by hand with the extent of the rust and flaky paint, I'm just going to take everything apart and I'm going to send it off to the sandblaster and just get the chassis, maybe the whole front suspension, all that stuff sandblasted, cleaned up. That way it's faster for me and I can kind of see what I'm dealing with. I noticed a little bit more rust in the front frame horns and the cross tube than I would like, so those might need to be replaced. But I want to see what's going to happen after everything's sandblasted. So from this point forward, I'm going to go ahead and start disassembling all the front and rear suspension and those components, and I can get everything ready to go to the sandblaster. That way, when it's blasted, I can start putting everything back together and building fresh. So let's get to taking stuff apart. All right, so I went ahead and pulled the front wheels off and the front shocks off. The shocks I'm not going to reuse. They're just kind of old and I'll replace them with new. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this front hub off so we can get this moon disc out of the way. Slide this over, set it to the side for now. So then I can come in, we're going to pull the cotter pins and stuff out of all the steering. That way we can take it apart, get it all sandblasted, cleaned up. I'm going to put new tie rod ends in. So I'll just start by taking all the cotter pins out. Which sometimes can be a little bit of a chore, depending on how corroded they are from the salt. So that's one thing with a salt flat car, is there tends to be a fair amount of corrosion because you are racing on a surface of salt. So things can get pretty crusty if you're not careful. While I'm on this side, I'll go ahead and take this hub off as well. That way it's one less thing to do later. And we will sit it to the side and put the nut back on. This one's a little stuck, so I'm gonna spray a little bit of Croil on there. Just hopefully to help free that up a little bit. And it broke and it's coming out in multiple pieces, which is fine as long as we can get it out of there. Got that out. Now we can loosen up all the 3/4 inch nuts holding the tie rod ends on. We can get those popped loose and the front suspension will be almost ready to come off. So we use the impact just to pop these loose for now. I'm not going to take them all the way off just yet. Leave it on there a little bit, just so we don't lose the nuts right away. And I can leave it kind of finger tight while I get everything else disassembled once we break everything loose from the taper of the tie rod end itself. All right, to pop these loose, I've got our pickle fork here. in our air impact. That's another reason why I like to leave the nut on there so it doesn't come shooting out. Just gives it a little bit to catch. And from here, I want to take the steering box loose. That way I can get it all cleaned up, see if there's any seals that need replaced on it, and get this old universal pulled off so I can get that replaced. I'll get this taken apart so we can get it out of the bracket and set it to the side for now. Three of the bolts came out no problem, but there's a fourth bolt that's tucked up down underneath. And the problem was, it looks like that may have been put on before the bracket and box were put on. So what it appears is that the box was bolted to the bracket, and then the bracket and everything was welded on, and then the secondary gusset was put in. So that's going to make it quite a bit more challenging. I might have to cut the box bracket itself off of the frame to be able to separate the box from the bracket. So that adds a little bit more work to it, and not really ideal, but it is kind of what it is. So for now, I'm just going to continue taking everything else apart, and I'll come back and deal with this section a little bit later. I used a wrench to break everything loose versus the ratchet, just to give myself a little bit more leverage, because the wrench was a touch longer than the ratchet. And our threads here are getting a little crusty at the end from the rust buildup, so I'm going to run those back in a little bit, and I will spray some more Kroil on them. And I might let them sit for a couple days with the Kroil on it to help break some of that rust loose. And I might even come back over it with a dye and just chase some of that rust off. With the front end mostly taken apart, other than the steering box and the spring clamp bolts, I'm going to go ahead and take the rear suspension apart. So I'm going to take the coilovers off, the panhard bar off, and then I'll jump up and I'll take the front mount for the wishbone off, and then the back will be loose. And then we can finish up what we were doing on the front, and from there we can take the frame off to the sandblaster and get it all cleaned up. So I'll start by taking the panhard bar mount off of the frame. And we will set our panhard bar here to the side. Then we can take our coilover bolts loose. And I'm just not going to take them all the way off yet. Then on to the front of the rear wishbone mounts. We have to take this bolt out, which is attached to the safety catch here in case the rear wishbone breaks. At the front, it'll get caught and not drop into the salt. And we'll do the same to the other side. And with the bolts out, I'll just take a pair of channel locks here, and we'll just bend that out of the way so we can get the wishbone out once we get this front bolt out. Then we can take the front mount off of the wishbone. So our threads are just a little crusty there. I'm going to put some Kroil on there just to help lubricate it from where it was getting stuck there. And I'll go ahead and put some on that side. And we'll move to the other side. And once it starts to get a little hard, I just run it back in. And I put a little bit extra Kroil on there, but I'll run it back in and then run it back out as need be till it comes off relatively easy. All right, came off easy that time. The rear coilover mounts on the frame are loose. The front mount of the rear wishbone is off. So from here, I'm just going to grab a couple jack stands so I can lift everything off and we can set the frame down and be supported on the jack stands. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put the floor jack under the rear end, lift the rear end up, move our jack stands underneath the frame. Then I can take our coilover bolts the rest of the way out, and we can lower the rear end to the ground and leave the frame up in the air at the back. So the rear end is free. I lowered our jack stands down and put them in a better spot. Now that we got the rear end out, now we can come back up and I can finish taking the front end apart. If you remember earlier in this video, these bolts, the threads were pretty gummed up with rust, so I sprayed them down. That was actually a couple days ago, and I let it sit and soak in. So I'm gonna put our little impact on here, see if we can just knock these off. All right, so I got the front U-bolt nuts off the bottom of the clamp. They put up a little bit of a fight, but perseverance came through, so they're off. And pretty much all I need to do is finish taking the wishbone mounts loose at the back, which is just finger tight nuts on the rod end. So take those loose, swing them out a little bit, and the frame will be loose, and we can get it ready to go over to the sandblaster to get all cleaned up. All right, so everything's loose here, ready to come apart. I just noticed that I forgot to finish taking the steering box off here. So we have one bolt that I can't get to on the back side. So I think what we're gonna have to do is cut this gusset off the back. I'll move the camera around and you can see it, but there's a gusset that was put on after the fact that's kind of making it tough to get to that final bolt. So I think I'm gonna have to cut that off, but let me show you the gusset. So right here is the gusset that's kind of in the way. So I think I'm going to have to cut these stitch welds off. That way I can get in here to get that last bolt on the bottom, and then we'll have everything else cleared off. So let me get the cutoff wheel and we'll get to cutting. So even with that gusset cut out, I still can't quite get a socket on there without grinding one of my sockets down, which I really don't want to do. So I'm going to put a pair of needle nose vice grips on the nut back here that you would think that I'd be able to get a socket on, but it's the same kind of problem. There's a casting on the back of the box that makes it tough to get a socket on there, and I'd have to cut my socket down. So let's see if I can use these needle nose vice grips and get it to pop loose. It turned a little bit. All right, there we go. It was actually easier than I thought. All right, so with that off of there, we can take the box out. You can see that I really don't even know if I could get the bolt out. Yeah, the bolt is stuck in there, so luckily I'm going to cut this bracket off and we're going to make a new bracket. I would still like to use this Volkswagen bus steering box just because that's what was on the car, and I don't want to change everything out. Like I said with the frame, if I start changing too much stuff, it won't be the original car anymore. So I'm going to set this box to the side. I'm probably going to come in here and go ahead and cut this bracket off. And there's one other little bracket that the steering box was in the way that I couldn't get off before. So get those cut off, and then the frame will be ready to load up and take to the sandblaster. All right, with the steering box off, everything cleaned up. Like I said, I'm going to leave the wishbone mounts on for now, just till I get it sandblasted. That way I've got a reference point to hang everything back on the chassis before I build new mounts for the suspension. So everything's loose. It's pretty much ready to come apart. I just got to get a pry bar in there, pop the spring out, and we can take the frame off to the sandblaster, and yeah, we'll get it all cleaned up. Get it back in here, but before I do any of that, I gotta clean this mess up that's all over the floor. So while I do that, I just wanna thank you guys for checking out this video and the series on the Hanchard Special. So drop down in the comment section, let me know what you think, and I'm really excited to progress on this project with getting everything all cleaned up, new mounts, new roll cage, everything updated and back on the salt. So I want to thank you guys again so much for checking out this video and the channel. Make sure to subscribe, tell a friend, drop down in the comment section, and like always, we'll catch you guys on the next one.